Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Mills, director of the Bates College Museum of Art. Before we introduce this evening's distinguished lecturer, Gail Scott, I have some serious news. The museum is open. We're so glad, and we are so looking forward to all of you visiting. So go to bates.edu/museum for visitor protocols. Just a reminder, we're open Monday and Wednesday, 10 a.m. until 7:30 p.m. Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 10 to 5. We're closed on Sundays. And we have two fine exhibitions on view currently. Carl Benton Straub, His Enduring Legacy, which is a reflection on Carl's particular interest on aesthetic traditions of the American landscape. And it's selected from this revered and influential scholar, teacher, and academic leader at Bates, the works he gave to the museum and those acquired through a longstanding endowment he established in the name of his parents. That exhibition is on view until October 16th. And a little clue with what's behind me, the astounding exhibition, Marsden Hartley, Adventure in the Arts, organized in partnership with the Vilcek Foundation. It brings together over 35 paintings and drawings, including master works and a painting never exhibited previously in the US, along with selected personal possessions and painting materials. And it really looks at Hartley, who never lived in the same place for a year, his entire adult life, through the lens of place. And then next up, in Adventurous Spirit, the Jane Costello Wellahan collection, which opens November 5th, selected from a remarkable collection of nearly 100 works, predominantly by artists living or exhibiting in Maine, that Jane, a longtime friend of the museum, alumna, and one of many of her family to attend Bates, gave to the museum last year. So on behalf of the staff, we very much look forward to seeing you in the museum. Thank you. I now turn this over to Education Curator Anthony Shostak to introduce this evening's lecturer.
Thank you, Dan. Before I do that, I just wanted to let you all know that after the talk, we will have some time for questions. If you have a question you would like to share with our speaker, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat. We will see it if it's in the Q&A, and we may not if it's in the chat. The chat also allows you to upvote a question that might be similar to a question that you have, so it gains a little bit of prominence that way. It might rise to the top. And for those of you who are shy, you have the option of asking your question anonymously. So with that said, Gail R. Scott began her career as assistant curator of modern art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and has subsequently been active as an independent scholar, guest curator, consultant, and lecturer in the field of American modernism. She has published extensively, including exhibition catalogs, articles, and monographs on such artists as Richard Diebenkorn, Wallace Berman, Chuck Close, Don Neese, Carl Sprinchorn, Marguerite and William Zorach, and E. Ambrose Webster. Most importantly, Scott is a leading authority on Marsden Hartley, having specialized since the 1970s on all aspects of his artistic and literary work. She has authored journal articles and written a definitive monograph on his art, published by Abbeville Press in 1988. She's edited a collection of his essays on art topics, On Art by Marsden Hartley by Horizon Press in 1982, and a volume of his poetry, The Collected Poems of Marsden Hartley, from Black Sparrow Press in 87. She curated exhibitions and contributed essays on his work for such catalogues as American Modernism, the Shine Collection for the National Gallery in 2010, and the Scharf Collection, A History Revealed in 2018. Scott has been no stranger to the museum's collection, having been a major contributor to research into our Hartley collection over the years. Some of the results of this work can be seen in the object records accessible through the museum's online collection catalog, and I welcome you all to explore that through our website. In 2012, she began to work on a complete inventory of Hartley's oeuvre, which in 2019 evolved into a collaboration with the Bates College Museum of Art. With funding from the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz Foundation, this partnership inaugurated the Marsden Hartley Legacy Project, the Paintings and Works on Paper, which will be a comprehensive, publicly accessible, annotated online catalog of all known paintings and works on paper created by Hartley during his lifetime. The Legacy Project, together with the museum's own Marsden Hartley Memorial Collection, will place Bates College as a major center of Hartley scholarship and establish a legacy befitting Martin Hartley's place in American art. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Gail Scott.
Thank you, Anthony. And I want to thank everyone at the Bates Museum, the staff, Dan Mills and Bill Lowe for inviting me to speak, and Anthony as my backup tonight, and then Corey Audette also on the staff at the museum. And I'm so pleased to be here and to welcome everyone to this of the second talks in relation to the exhibition at the museum, Marsden Hartley Adventure in the Arts. So Anthony, let's go to the slideshow and start.
Are we all seeing that?
Okay, we set to go?
I think so.
All right, next slide, Anthony. Here's an array of photographs of Hartley at various times during his life. And I've been engaged with, working on, or thinking about the visual art and the writings of Marsden Hartley on and off for most of my career. And the two questions that people most frequently ask me are, how did you get interested in Marsden Hartley? And what has drawn you to his art for such a long time? So we'll begin with addressing these two questions, followed by an overview of how the Legacy Project evolved, and then a few exciting stories of discovery of lost works of his, as well as some of the challenges I faced in attempting to catalog about 1,670 works by this single artist. Next slide. One of my first assignments as a new assistant curator. Next slide, Anthony. As a new assistant curator of modern art at my first job, as Anthony mentioned, at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, was to research the possibility of mounting an exhibition of Hartley's World War I abstractions, known now collectively as the German Officer Series or German Military Series. The most well-known of the series seen here is Portrait of a German Officer, also known as Portrait of My Friend. It's a semi-abstract elegy to Karl von Freiberg, who was Hartley's friend and probable lover, who was killed in the very first battle of World War I. Even then, when I was doing this research in the late 1960s, these works were highly prized and valuable. Nearly all of them were in museum collections. Other examples in the series include, next slide, Abstraction, Military Symbols, now in the Toledo Museum in Ohio. Next slide, and Military in the Cleveland Museum, also in Ohio. And next, Warriors, which is the only painting in this series owned privately now, and one of only about 10 Hartleys in collections outside the United States. Despite my research efforts on the German officer paintings, We never carried through on this exhibition at the museum because the budget for it would have exceeded the available funds for what we envisioned as a small scale exhibition. But I was intrigued to discover these very dramatic semi-abstract works from the earliest years of the development of American modernism, and by an artist I knew very little about. Next slide. Among the paintings I located at that time was one that was not in a museum, but in a private hands, and its pyramid and cross on the left. I was smitten by this small work, by the vibrancy of color and the stunning but quite simple abstract design set so dramatically against the blackest of black backgrounds. This, and then the painting on the right, which is in the Vilcek collection, Berlin Series #1, belong to a group of small and large scale paintings and drawings executed by Hartley in Berlin, but just before the tragedy of von Freyberg's death. They were inspired by the vast collections of Native American artifacts in Berlin's Natural History Museum that Hartley saw while there. These objects prompted another series, which he called his America works, A-M-E-R-I-K-A, he spelled it, in which he borrowed and appropriated motifs, symbols, and abstract designs from Native American cultures that he was exposed to in Europe. Next slide. These two charcoal drawings, again from the Vilcek collection, that mark a striking contrast to those very intense primary colors of most of the paintings in the America series, as well as those in the German officer paintings. Here, Hartley explores in monochrome the bare bones of those Native American designs. Next slide. Schiff, or the Canoe, also in the Vilcek collection, belongs to the America series. And next. 2 years earlier, but it was painted in Paris, as was the painting on the left here, called Indian Pottery. 2 years earlier, while Hartley was in Paris, he had also seen indigenous art collections in the Trocadero Museum in Paris and painted this still life. These paintings complement another major part of the Vilcek's art collection, their extensive holdings of American Indian pottery, an interest they developed over many years of research and study. Notice here the similarity of the motif of a bird with a splayed tail feathers in Hartley's painting and in the Zia jar from the Vilcek collection. Around the same time as my research at the museum, which was way back in 1968, I saw the large exhibition titled Marsden Hartley, Painter Poet at the University of Southern California, USC. That show included 110 works. Not since the memorial exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1944, a year after Hartley's death, had so many Hartleys been brought together. So this was an amazing opportunity for me to immerse myself in the full range of his work. And it was an experience that grabbed me and clinched my interest in this not so easy to understand American modernist artist. And interestingly, it was only while preparing this talk that I realized that the USC show did not include any of the German military series that I was simultaneously researching at my job at the museum. Next slide. Oh, there's the, sorry, I forgot to forward to that slide. That's the catalog for the USC exhibition. Next slide, Anthony. So it would be another 12 years before Hartley's German military paintings took front and center and were, in a sense, rediscovered for late 20th century audiences. In her 1980 Hartley retrospective exhibition At the Whitney Museum of American Art, Barbara Haskell chose 15 of the German military paintings and dramatically displayed them together in a big gallery. They were the hit of the show and drew much audience and critical attention. Haskell's focus on these early abstract masterpieces by Hartley, their daring originality and stunning visual presence, ushered in a long overdue renaissance of critical acclaim, scholarship, and market interest, a decisive turn in the assessment of Hartley's unique contribution to American modernism. I saw both the 1968 and 1980 shows and was stimulated by both. But I've got to admit that as a first exhibition encounter, that earlier exhibition at USC won my heart over to Hartley. The painter-poet subtitle and that underlying theme of the painter and the poet aligned with what I eventually came to understand as the largeness of Marsden Hartley's intellect, his imagination, and his artistry. Next slide. The USC exhibition included this bronze portrait head of Hartley by sculptor Jacques Lipschitz on the right, which also graced the cover of the 1945 volume of poems by Hartley, edited by Henry W. Wells. You see the book on the left. A friend, an older gentleman, and something of a mentor to me at the time, guided me through the USC exhibition and talked enthusiastically about each painting or drawing. He also gave me a copy of this book of Hartley's poems. As a result of many wonderful, deep conversations between us, this friend opened my eyes, as it were, to Marsden Hartley and encouraged me to look more deeply into the fullness of his artistry, the artworks and the words that stemmed from his dual gifts as visual artist and poet. Henry Wells reproduced 8 paintings by Hartley in that book. They were only in black and white, but nevertheless, they resonated in one way or another with one or more of the poems in this volume. For instance, let's look at next slide. This is Hartley's portrait painting of Albert Pinkham Ryder, matched with his poem titled Albert Ryder Moonlightist, an excerpt of which reads, "Moonlight severing his ancient mariner's beard and falling over the cliffs of his eyebrows, his lips fearing to touch what was no longer available. This beautiful man suffering from the weight of majesty of dream." I am speaking of Albert Ryder, Moonlightist, as I knew him. "I asked him to Christmas dinner," the lady said to me, who had long time known him. "He said he would come. We waited 2 hours for him. The party, eager to see him. He did not come. Next time she saw him, oh, we were so disappointed you did not come." "I was there," said Ryder. "I looked through the window, saw the lovely lights. It was very beautiful." In painting and poem, Hartley manages to capture the essence of Ryder, who, despite being shy and something of a recluse, has had an enormous influence among a wide variety of artists from the early 20th century to the present. Next slide. The contemporary iconoclastic artist, Mike Bildo, known for his appropriation of other artists' work in the form of his own freehand drawings of their paintings, recently exhibited his Not Marsden Hartley series of pencil drawings, reproducing over 200 paintings by Hartley. Here you see an angled installation photo showing his version of the Ryder portrait. In researching Hartley, Bildo not only studied his paintings closely, but also read his poetry and autobiography and concluded he was a remarkably erudite artist who could read, write, and paint. Indeed, though he had little formal education, Hartley's mind was unusually broad in its scope of interests. In his own self-taught manner, he was deeply grounded in the American transcendentalism of Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman, as well as Eastern and European mystical traditions ranging from the Bhagavad Gita, Madame Blavatsky, Richard Rolla, and Master Eckhart, among others. The breadth of his reading and writing were not just secondary to his life as a painter either. It was all part of the fabric of his mind, the interweaving of the forces and ideas, the imaginings and investigations engendered by his intellectual and geographical wanderings. To me, Hartley can't be pigeonholed. I see the universalist in Marsden Hartley, who forever lived the creed that he voiced in a 1913 letter to Alfred Stieglitz, where he says about Paris, "It has freed me intellectually and spiritually. I have discovered my essential self here. The sources that have helped me to my newest means of expression are without geography. It is a universal essence. I came to it by way of James's pragmatism, slight touches of Bergson, and directly through the fragments of mysticism that I have found." Next slide. And to turn to another contemporary artist for a different perspective on Hartley, perhaps some of you are familiar with Maine artist Natasha Meyers and the political and social activism that informs her art. This summer, I attended an event featuring a new independent documentary film about her. Here's the poster for it. And what struck me was the subtitle, An Unstill Life. A wordplay, of course, on the art mode of still life. And if you take the French term for it, nature morte, or dead nature, being unstill, or an art that is unsettling to the viewer, is certainly desirable. And it goes to the very heart of my own long engagement with Hartley. Next slide. I first discovered this quality of unsettledness in a body of work done by Hartley in the 1930s at the place called Dogtown Common, a weird and somewhat desolate landscape of rock formations and huge boulders strewn about when Ice Age glaciers receded from the area that is now the Cape Ann Peninsula in Massachusetts. Besides the glacial moraines, the vegetation is sparse and stunted with blueberry bushes, low shrubs, and juniper trees, as well as remnants of human presence, the foundations and barbed wire fences of colonial settlements, and graffiti on many of the rock outcroppings. The majority of artists, however, who are attracted to this region prefer to paint in the seaport town of Gloucester with its picturesque houses, harbor scenes, and boats, such as you see here on the left, John Sloane's Breezy Day, Gloucester from 1915. Not so Hartley, who instead chose Dogtown, which was a decidedly unpicturesque, remote, and barren stretch of land, as you see here in the painting Rock Doxology from 1931. Next slide. Contrasting his love of city sophistication with Dogtown, Hartley told a friend, "For purposes of work, I am always driven to the wastes, where nothing moves but the speechless progress of the geological structures of the earth." So to get to the wasteland of Dogtown, Hartley, who had no car and never learned to drive, would take the bus from Gloucester and then hike 4 or 5 miles into the area. As was his usual practice with landscape, he would just sit and ponder, maybe perhaps occasionally making a sketch. But none of the Dogtown paintings were done on site, primarily because he couldn't lug an easel, paint box, camp stool all that way. Instead, he allowed the painting to come into being via imaginative recollection of the subject back in his studio. Next slide. On the left, you see one of about 8 renderings by Hartley of a Dogtown rock formation named locally the whale's jaw because of its resemblance to the jaws of a breaching whale. In the painting, you see initials and names carved or marked onto the lower jaw. Graffiti on these rocks came and went over the years. At upper right, you see a postcard of the rock from around 1910, where you can see some graffiti, as well as the stark barrenness of the place at that time. Bottom right is a photograph I took in 1974 that shows more abundant trees and bushes, as well as painted graffiti from what appears to be 1959. Billy was here. What was going on in Hartley's mind while he just sat among these boulders and shrubs? Obviously, more than mere observation of the strange terrain. He gives a hint in an inscription on the back of one of the Dogtown paintings, where he quotes lines from T.S. Eliot's recently published poem, Ash Wednesday. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still, even among these rocks. Those last words, even among these rocks, are Hartley's. It's his riff on Eliot's poetic plea for us to learn to be still. Here, Hartley was telling himself that out of an inner stillness comes creativity. Next slide. On the left is Green Landscape number 3 from 1936, with old stone walls, fence posts, twisted loops of barbed wire. On the right, you see one of his many ink drawings executed in rapid staccato stabs and dashes of the pen that are indeed unsettling in effect, both the painting and the drawing. What intrigues me about Hartley is this constant dialect that informs his creative process. On the one hand, the need to be still and enter into a place. And on the other hand, the unsettling, agitated, and emotionally fraught element in dialogue with that inner contemplation. An owner of one of the Dogtown paintings recently put it this way: I've been looking at Hartley's work for 30 years and found it to be unsettling. And yet I kept coming back to his paintings and wondering why. He goes on to say that an article he had read on Hartley, quote, helped me to intellectually and emotionally understand what I have come to feel, that the strength, emotion, and simplicity of his work and its honesty have captured me, end quote. This same unsettling quality of Hartley's work is precisely what captured me at the beginning of my career, has lured me back over the many intervening years, and is the motivating energy behind my work on the Marsden Hartley Legacy Project today. Hartley was a perpetual seeker, and what he sought, he once said, is to convey the emotions beneath the pattern as sharply as possible. He wasn't simply depicting or rendering a place or a vase of flowers or a shell, but more importantly, giving the viewer something of the same inner or emotional or spiritual experience that he himself had when sitting among the Dogtown rocks. Through his paintings and drawings, he invites us to explore or grapple with the internal and external unsettledness of our lives. Next slide. And at moments of pure genius, Hartley did, in fact, achieve profound stillness, as in these two paintings, Three Shells in the Vilcek collection and Robin on the right, the dead robin. Hartley takes the genre of still life to new and inventive heights in his many paintings of shells, dead birds, and other sea creatures. As with the German officer paintings, these are elegies, hymns of remembrance to these simple objects or creatures. Through his own poetic sense of empathy, he evokes their presence, etched against the depths of a black or a softly modulated neutral background. The effect is to evoke in us as viewers a similar response of empathy and stillness and grace. This brings me to the juncture of how and why of what brought me to this point, which is the development of the Hartley Legacy Project. Next slide. Among his American modernist peers, Georgia O'Keeffe, John Marin, Arthur Dove, and others, Hartley alone has no catalogue raisonné or complete compendium of his work, despite several attempts by eminent art historians over the years. So this is a long overdue and much needed project. I began working independently on it some years ago, and then about 3 years ago realized that for the project to fly, it needed institutional sponsorship. One idea was to find one of several American museums, such as the Weizmann Museum in Minneapolis, that have a large collection of Hartley works. They have over 100 paintings and drawings. However, as a Mainer myself, and knowing how much Hartley as a native son wanted to be recognized by the state of Maine and his work to be in Maine collections, my first choice was a Maine museum. Bates College in Lewiston, Hartley's birthplace, with its own historically important Hartley Memorial Collection, was a natural fit. And to my delight, the idea was so enthusiastically embraced by the museum staff 3 years ago. With initial generous funding from the Horowitz Family Foundation, the Legacy Project journey continues to evolve. In June, we launched a Hartley Legacy webpage, which you see here, on the museum's website. In August, we hired Colton Klein as project manager, and with Colton's art history training and technical skills and the Bates team, the project is no longer a solo endeavor, but it's gaining momentum and degree of public exposure every day. Next slide. The project has a cloud-based platform enabling access by the staff from anywhere, me in Portland, or wherever I travel, Colton in New York, the museum staff in Lewiston. Here you see an image of a typical database page for the painting Hall of the Mountain King from 1908 to 9, which was featured on the public web page that you just saw. Eventually, Panopticon, the company we're working with, will transform most of the information you see here into a cleaner format on the publicly accessible website. All of Hartley's work will be available on the internet then for any viewer to explore, search for a specific work, browse for paintings or drawings from different time periods, or see and compare a group of works on a particular theme. You'll be invited to immerse yourself in the art and life of Marsden Hartley. Here's Panopticon's homepage announcing the recently published Arthur Dove catalog raisonné. Panopticon has the capacity to design both the website format and to prepare the content for a book publication. Next slide. These projects are designed by Panopticon in cooperation with the scholars and project managers, but they live or are hosted by other entities, sometimes an artist's foundation, sometimes, as here, with Eastman Johnson with the National Academy of Design in New York, or in our situation, a website that will be hosted by Bates College Museum of Art. Next slide. So these are a few pages from what is online for the Eastman Johnson Catalogue Raisonné. This is a typical basic entry page for a work by him. It's what that kind of page would look like. Next slide. And then the viewer would have options for digging deeper, as here, where the red arrows are pointing to clickable links to the provenance, which ideally traces the ownership of each work all the way back to the artist. Next slide. You could also click on the exhibition history to see a list of exhibitions that particular painting was included in. And then you could also go deeper into the details of say for instance, the 1946 exhibition at M. Nudler Gallery. Next slide, where you will find information and images of all the works in that exhibition. Next slide. Here is Albert Pinkham Ryder again. This time you see another kind of supplementary information in the section for commentary and description. In this case, the commentary cites a letter from 1938 that describes Hartley's idea, the idea behind this portrait. He tells his friend, "I want so much to try to get a vision down of Albert Ryder as I knew him and saw him often evenings on 8th Avenue, dressed in gray wools with a wool skull cap of gray, hands behind his back, I stopping to say good evening to him." So by the end of that summer, 1938, he had completed this portrait. Explanations like this will amplify a viewer's understanding of the work and maybe perhaps tell something of the artist's creative process in making it. Next slide. With the flexibility of an interactive online collection of an artist's work, a viewer can search and select a group of related paintings, a series, or a theme, such as the many works in the 1913 to 15 German military series that we were looking at earlier on the left. This is only 15 of a few of more of them. Or a group of still life paintings of one of Hartley's favorite flowers, the calla lily, on the right. Like other artists, Monet's Haystacks or Rouen Cathedral or Cézanne's Mont Sainte-Victoire, Hartley often explored a subject or a theme by this same serial method, producing multiple paintings or drawings one after another, sometimes within a short period of time, or sometimes returning to a particular motif at intervals over his whole career. Next slide. Viewers will be amazed, for example, to learn that there are 44 paintings in Hartley's New Mexico Recollection series, and they were mostly executed within the period of about 1 year. So here you see only 15 of the 44 images from the New Mexico Recollection series. Next slide. Here's a group of small paintings of stormy seas with exaggerated cloud formations and heavy waves that threaten and dwarf a lone three-masted sailing ship on the horizon. The first time I was able to pull together these 7 intense and dramatic paintings, I was amazed to ponder the fact that Hartley painted these works within the short space of 2 or 3 months in response to the drowning of the 2 brothers of the Mason family with whom he was living in Nova Scotia in 1936. Like the German officer series, these storm-tossed sailboats are elegies to people he loved. His empathy made all the more poignant by repetition. And from this screen, a viewer could click on one of these thumbnails, next slide, to view the main entry for it, or click on the thumbnail image to enlarge it, as you see on the right, and even hover over it to see really up close details that reveal his masterful brushwork. Next slide. Eventually, we also hope to sponsor scholarly forums and feature a rotating link to important scholarly articles by historians with differing interpretations and assessments of Hartley's work. And unique to Hartley, the website will in time include a component focusing on his other great talent, his writings, the published poems, books, essays, and possibly a selection of unpublished writings and letters, as well as a complete bibliography. And now on to some of the challenges and joys of working on the Hartley project. Next slide. At left is a typical archival record that I started with as I first began my own inventory of Hartley's works. These forms, usually with a small black and white image, were originally compiled in the period just after Hartley died in 1943 through about 1961. They became part of his estate and are now housed at the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. These documents were digitized around 2010 so that all of this earlier research is now readily available on the internet. It's very convenient. At right is the painting itself, Petunias from Lachaise's garden from 1937 to 38. This painting was purchased by Hartley's dealer in 1946 and has remained in the same family ever since then. However, not all works have such a clear ownership as this one. Next slide. Here are examples of perhaps our biggest challenge, locating missing works. Currently, the database includes approximately 250 works listed as present whereabouts unknown, meaning that they are presumed lost or have been reported as stolen, or the ownership lineage came to a dead end decades ago and can't be traced to a present owner. These will require deep digging and a bit of luck. The still life of lilies on the left was painted by Hartley while on a Guggenheim Fellowship in Mexico in 1932. Its title is recorded in the checklist of an exhibition he had in Mexico City, but the only image of it is this black and white photograph, which was found among Hartley's belongings at the end of his life and now archived in the memorial collection at Bates. We have no clue to its current whereabouts, though. The two landscapes at the right, also known only by these black and white images, were last owned by collectors in the 1980s. Then they disappeared from public view, and I haven't been able to trace them to a current owner. As the Legacy Project gains more traction online, we hope that collectors and others will come forward and that these whereabouts unknown will come to light. Next slide. And wonderful moments do occasionally happen, such as when just a few weeks ago, I was able to fill in a lot of missing puzzle pieces for this painting, Beaver Lake, Lost River region, New Hampshire from 1930. The story surrounding this painting started back in 1943, the year Hartley died. For the last 3 years of his life, or more exactly, the summer and fall seasons of 1941, 42, 43, Hartley boarded with a fisherman's family in the downeast village of Korea, Maine. Next slide. Pictured here are Forrest and Katie Young around the time that Hartley lived with them. He loved Korea and the simple, hardworking lives of the Youngs. As the story goes, he promised to give a painting to each of Forrest and Katie's children, Joseph and Louise, who were both in their 20s at the time. Louise was a photographer and took these photographs and many others of her parents and life in Korea. Unfortunately, Hartley died without a will, and his verbal promise was ignored by his estate. Finally, however, years later, friends of Hartley's who owned a lot of his work learned of the promise and gave Joseph and Louise each a painting. Decades later, in the 1880s and 90s, family heirs sold the works. I knew vaguely about these gifts, but I couldn't identify which paintings had belonged to Joseph or Louise. That is, until recently when I finally went up to Korea. There I met descendants of Katie and Forrest Young and heard wonderful stories about Hartley's time with the family and details about one of these gift paintings. The folks I talked with had no photographs or records of the paintings and couldn't really quite remember the title, just that in 1979, with one of the paintings wrapped in a blanket in the trunk of the car, they drove to Washburn Gallery in New York City, where they consigned it for sale. Next slide. That rang a bell with me because I recalled this 1980 Washburn Gallery advertisement, and I had buried away in my files somewhere. So after I got home, I sent the family an image of this ad illustrating Beaver Lake. And sure enough, they positively identified it as their painting. And then came more wonderful family stories about how the painting was stored away in a closet that was also a favorite hiding place for the kids, hide and seek games. So where they crouched right in there, right next to the Marsden Hartley painting in the back of the closet. Or later, when they realized that it might be worth a lot of money, they looked into insuring it because the house had no locks and there was a wood stove and the fire department was a couple of miles away. The only company that would touch it was Lloyd's of London, but at an exorbitant premium, which they declined. So for all those years, it just lived happily and safely in several Down East homes of the Young family. Encounters like these, especially when shared spontaneously by Hartley owners, are indeed some of the great joys of the work that I do. Next slide. Other satisfying moments include the discovery of previously unknown works. For instance, while searching for something else on the internet last year, I happened upon the catalog and some installation photographs of an exhibition, a little known exhibition from 1914 that included 4 Hartley paintings. I recognized 2 of the works, number 27 on the checklist, which is now known as painting number 1, and that you see on the lower left, and Cosmos, number 28 on that checklist on the bottom right, where it's titled Landscape, but it's now known as Cosmos. Neither of the images, of the other images or titles of the other 2 were known to me. And peering into these not too clear installation photographs, I was able to determine that these 2 paintings had never been seen or reproduced anywhere else since that exhibition in 1914, at least to public knowledge. And interestingly, this catalog exhibition, you see a little cutout from it here, has some comments by the viewer who owned a copy of the exhibition catalog. And his comments show just how radically unsettling Hartley's work was for that early 20th century time. This person writes, "Ugly" for number 27, titled here as Landscape, but is now one of Hartley's most iconic early landscapes. About the 2 mystic paintings, the person's frank comments were "frightening spider, enormous spider nightmare." So that's a 1914 reaction to Marsden Hartley. Next slide. Here are two paintings that until recently I had only seen in poor black and white reproductions and had no current owner for them. But they both came to light earlier this year. One through an auction and the other by following a hunch. Increasingly, auction houses are contacting the Legacy Project for information and confirmation of Hartley's works being consigned to them for sale. The image on the right is one of 4 versions Hartley painted of the Mexican volcano Catapult that Selkirk auctioneers in St. Louis notified me about prior to the auction. And as it turned out, the Vilceks purchased it from that sale and it's on view at the museum. In the case of the painting on the right, I knew it only from this black and white illustration in a 1987 exhibition catalog. I had heard that it was owned by a collector by the name of Peter Sheldon, who lived in Windham, Maine. But here I am 23 years later, not sure if he's still alive or if he still owns it, and having no contact information for this man. I did some simple Google people searching for his name and Windham, Maine, made a few deductions among the possibilities, and called the number listed. Twice, someone answered the phone, but hung up without saying anything. So I wrote a letter, which is typically the least effective method for ferreting out an owner. That was January of this year. No response to the letter. So I sort of gave up, went on to other things. Then in June, out of the blue, I got a phone call. It's a Portland attorney telling me that 3 days before my letter arrived, Peter Sheldon had passed away, but that the Hartley painting I was inquiring about is in his estate in a vault at Key Bank in downtown Portland. Next slide. Finally, in August, I was able to examine the painting in the Key Bank vault, see and photograph it in all its stunningly rich color, as you see here, and talk with the collector's son about his father's passion for Hartley's work. Hartley is such a brilliant colorist that I can hardly describe what it's like to know one of his paintings for a long time, only in black and white, and then to experience it in all of its glorious and symbolic color. The votive nature of this small painting really only makes sense when it's seen in color. Its Eucharist theme memorializes the fisherman lost at sea, and it's conveyed through the celestial and watery blues, the deep sanguine of the background and in the chalice denoting the blood of Christ's sacrifice, and the ivory-colored aura that surrounds the chalice. There's a thrill to an encounter like this one, and it's a happy reward for the day-to-day computer-centered tedium of the work. Next slide. Other discoveries have involved real sleuthing. In 1914, Hartley sold these 2 vibrant abstractions and 2 others, which are still not identified and are probably lost, to a Prussian aristocrat and his wife. The sale was a big coup for the artist. He wrote excitedly to Alfred Stieglitz about it from Berlin. In the 1920s, that original owner sold 2 of the 4 paintings to another German aristocrat. He, in turn, managed to keep them from Nazi hands during World War II at his Schloss or baronial castle in Ostrau, Germany. However, with the breakup of Germany after the war, Ostrau was in East Germany, and the Soviets confiscated the castle and all the Baron's art treasures, including these 2 paintings, which they placed in a state museum in Halle, East Germany. Around 2003, at the behest of someone deeply interested in Hartley, I traveled to Halle to try to locate the rightful heir, the grandson of the Baron from whom they were confiscated. I found this assignment very intimidating, partly because of my limited German, but thankfully, a young German art history graduate student agreed to help with the detective work and act as driver and translator. The trip was fraught with both the challenges and the excitement of the chase. Somehow, we managed to connect with the heir's attorney, and that started a dialogue to encourage them to try to recover ownership of the two paintings. It took over a decade of legal actions by the heir and his lawyer, slogging through the bureaucracy of the German restitution system. But by 2014, both Hartley paintings had been returned to the rightful heir. Next slide. My efforts coincided with a number of other cases of art restitution, the most well-known being the restitution of this Gustav Klimt portrait, the story of which was told in the popular feature film, Woman in Gold. Next slide. Moreover, the fact that Schiff eventually found its way into the Vilcek collection is a fitting end to this tale and to my talk. As related in Jan Vilcek's memoir and recounted last week by Emily Navratil in her presentation, Jan and Marika Vilcek both struggled but survived the ravages of World War II, only to find themselves hunkering down in Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakia, while quietly building their careers in medical science and art history. And then their courageous defection to America in the early 1960s, where they literally landed in New York with not much more than the clothes on their backs. Through some fortuitous professional connections and sheer determination, their careers evolved and grew rapidly. From fragile immigrant beginnings in this country and over the decades since, they rose in their respective fields, built a foundation to recognize and support immigrants in different fields, and built the Vilcek Art Collection. From behind the Iron Curtain, both the Vilceks and Hartley's Schiff have found a new home together in America. So thank you all. We can go back to speaker view. And Anthony, we can go to some questions.
Very good. We have one from Connie Hayes, who says, when you single out works that become labeled masterworks, what are you identifying as characteristics?
Masterworks would mean some of his greatest and most important works that are recognized by many scholars as very significant. So for instance, the German officer painting, Portrait of a German Officer at the Metropolitan, is preeminently one of his great masterworks.
And how do you track down works that are in private collections?
That is very difficult. I have, over the years, I've had lists and indications of who owns what painting. I follow through to confirm it. Sometimes exhibition catalogs, older ones will list names that of owners. So historically, I can go back and see who owned a painting when. Very often, and the most difficult part of the job that I have is when paintings change hands from a gallery that has one for sale, or an auction where it's up for sale and goes from one owner to another. Very often, I mean, both of those entities, galleries and auction houses, are of course very careful and with the confidential information and privacy of private owners. So I have to write what is called a blind letter, or a to whom it may concern letter, and just hope that someone replies. But it's a difficult process and not always successful. But when people do come forward, I'm delighted. It's just so thrilling to, be able to find a current owner. But at the same time, I assure them that their privacy will be maintained if they don't wish their name to be publicly listed.
Craig Stockwell asks, I've never seen the Sailboat in Storm paintings before. They're a very impressive and expressive group. Can you say more about their size, history, and where they are?
Yes, they are all small paintings. None of them is large. And they are in various collections. One was purchased by a museum in Nova Scotia. So it came back home because the story of the memorial to the two sons who died at sea occurred in Nova Scotia. Others are in private hands, and one is owned by the Farnsworth Museum here in Maine. So what amazes me about them is that they have this standard format of a small ship on the horizon with very stormy seas and these dramatic and exaggerated cloud formations. And Hartley and so many other artists were loved the clouds in Albert Bingham Ryder's work. So in Hartley's very imaginative way, he exaggerates and makes the cloud formations actually a big part of the the subject that you're looking at.
Kit Pfeiffer asks, did Hartley have training as a poet or a mentor?
No, he had no training or mentorship in his writing of poetry. As in so many of the intellectual areas of his life, I mean, he had art training for sure. He went to art school in Cleveland and in New York. But in terms of his writing, he is really entirely self-taught, meaning that he learned from the great writers that he read. He learned a lot from Emerson, from reading Emerson's essays, and there are Emersonian cadences in his prose essays, and his only connection with other poets was after he had been writing poetry. He got to know such poets as William Carlos Williams and others, but he was already, I think by the time he knew William Carlos Williams, he was already a published poet. So these skills came to him by his own sheer interest and investigation.
He was regarded as an art critic as well, wasn't he?
Yes, he spent most of his winters in New York City, and he would go back to New York City because he wanted to see the art, both the current art and the art in the museums that he loved. And he would write about what he saw wherever he was, whether it was New York or Paris, or he has some wonderful essays from a trip that he took to Italy in the 20s, where he writes about Piero della Francesco and Fra Angelico and other artists of the Renaissance. So he was indeed something of a critic, but very idiosyncratic. It's a type of criticism, or writing about art, that is appreciative rather than a critique.
We have another question asking if you could tell us what his young life and family life were like.
Well, yes, his biography as a child was very sad and tragic. His parents were hardworking factory workers who had immigrated from England to the United States, to Lewiston. And Hartley's mother had 8 or 9 children. Several children died in infancy, but he was the youngest, and he was at that time the only boy, although a couple of the infants who had died had been boys. And his mother died when he was 8, so all of his sisters were older than he. Some of them actually adults, nearly adults by that time. The loss of his mother had a severe effect on his life as a youth. And it was a very difficult period of time that he writes about in both his poetry, in his and in his autobiography. He eventually moved from Lewiston in with some of his family in Cleveland, and it was there that he started studying art for, in a more serious way. And it was one of his art teachers in Cleveland who gave him a small volume of Emerson's essays and told him that with his aquiline nose, he resembled Emerson, and that she wanted to give this volume of essays to Hartley because she felt that Emerson would help him along his way to gain confidence, which indeed it did. So he eventually, overcame the sadness of his youth. But it was one of the reasons that eventually he left Maine for good and wanted to travel widely because it was a difficult place for him for many years until he finally came back at the end of his life.